we're dealing with, realizing the full business value of BIM. So we've got industry leaders that will really talk about how they've been leveraging collaborative BIM best practices to drive growth for their organization and customers. So next slide. So we'll start out with some introductions here. But so on today's webinar, what we'll be discussing is a topic. Obviously, it's front of mind for a lot of us in the building industry, and it's how organizations can realize the full value of BIM. The panel is made up of really a cross-section of people from each phase of the building life cycle and stakeholders from each of those phases, which I think will really provide some valid insight. Or some valuable insight. And we'll have a candid discussion around the challenges that each of us have seen in realizing ROI that we're expecting from the investment that we've all been making in BIM, and also some collaborative best practices that panel members have experienced and implemented to successfully drive growth for their organizations and customers. So my name is Dwayne Miller. I'll be kind of facilitating the conversation today, and I'm President of Buildings and Technology and Science for, or BTS at NV5 Global. I'm also a co-founder of UNIFI. So maybe Brittany, if you can go ahead and give an introduction, and then we'll just go around the horn.
Absolutely. I'm happy to be here on the webinar today. I am Brittany Campbell-Turner. I am a Senior Project Manager at MACE in the North America Project Management Consultancy Division. I'm also the host of the Constructor Podcast, so I have a lot of fun with that. Really happy to be here.
Great. Thanks, Brittany. Ken, if you can go ahead.
Yeah, sure. Ken Freeman here. My title is Senior Vice President of Demand Creation. A lot of people ask me, so, well, it's a pretty cool title. What is that? Basically, I lead the global account and specification efforts for Legrand, a global manufacturer of electrical and telecommunications products here in North America.
Okay, great. Thanks, Ken. Chris, you want to give a little background?
Yeah, well, Chris Diorio, I'm the CEO of EngineWorks. We are an engineering technology company providing services and solutions across the AEC lifecycle, and look over all of that.
Okay, Jim. Hello, Jim. Okay, well, Jim actually works with Dodge Data. He's a BIM specialist at Dodge Data and Analytics. He may be having some technical difficulties, but he's really a specification effort, and brings really good context for the manufacturers and also for the contractors that their organization works with. Next slide. So just some housekeeping things. Ask us questions during the webinar. There's a Q&A tab, so you can submit your questions to the panel. If you've got somebody specific you would like to respond to the question, please include that as well. We'll be collecting the questions throughout the event, and then there'll be a Q&A section at the end of the webinar, and we'll answer as many questions as possible. So if your question is not answered during the live event, look for an answer. The team will respond via email over the next few days. Next slide. So I think this really tells the story. I mean, if you look at this slide, and this comes from public data, and it starts out in '64, ends up in 2012. And I guess if you really boil it down to why are we having this conversation, depending on what statistics you look at, our construction sector and AEC and construction is, $10 to $12 trillion industry. And you can see, I'll explain the graph a little bit really quickly, but the blue line above is all non-farming industries, less construction. The red line represents the construction industry or the building industry, which is the AECs and the contracting community. So what it really amounts to is what we've been seeing is a steady drop in efficiencies over the past almost 50 years as buildings have gotten more complicated and really really our processes haven't changed. The disparate delivery process in a simpler building isn't as much of a challenge as what we're seeing now. Building information modeling and the purpose of our conversation today is, the belief of all the panelists, and I think of the industry in general, is that if we're able to leverage building information modeling the right way, hopefully we can bring this line up. And when you're talking about percentage points on $11 trillion, it's a really it's a critical conversation that is good for us to have. Next slide. So one of the things when we talk about the BIM engagement and really some evidence of increased efficiencies, the Dodge Data Smart BIM report, has published some findings that they're getting across the industry. So you're going to hear some things from panel members today that's anecdotal, but we've also got some smart market reports that Dodge has been kind enough to provide that you can really correlate, the anecdotal data to what's actually happening. So as far as the benefits of BIM, and I guess I should take a minute to explain high engagement users and what we mean by that. So for a high engagement user, what we're talking about is users with high BIM engagement, more than 50% of the projects they are on involve BIM. Users with low BIM engagement, for purpose of the statistics here, it's 50% or fewer projects are involved in BIM. And if you look at the benefits that are being realized, I mean, it comes down to better coordination, better quality, better performance of buildings, schedule, cost and budget improvements in terms of controls, safety went a little backwards. Maybe that's because people are walking around on sites with iPads if they're too BIM ready and they're bumping into stuff. I'm not sure, but all of the critical data is trending and demonstrating that the more BIM engagement there is, the return that we're getting is across all of those items that we discussed. Next slide. And along the same line, improved collaboration, less rework, which is cost savings, less waste, which is cost savings, and faster access via the cloud. And then finally, risk mitigation in terms of the supply chain risks and other risks associated with the project. So what the data is telling us is that, BIM is improving the brokenness that we saw on the slide that we started out with when we looked at the building industry inefficiencies. Next slide. So let's start off and really talk about what's the state of the industry and where are we at with BIM adoption. And what we've seen both in the domestic U.S. and globally is that there's a heavy adoption of BIM, and that's not just in the domestic U.S. but also across Asia, Australia, the U.K., and across Europe. So the platform and the technology is really here to stay. And I think what we've seen consistently as well is that Revit has been, it's a dominant platform. It's the platform that we've seen all over the world that's being used, and I think that has a lot to do with AutoCAD's legacy, adoption of AutoCAD. And then the adoption also, it really varies substantially from organization to organization. I'd like to, the common theme is it's increasing across both, actually across AEC and operators and BPMs. And I'd like to really engage our panelists at this point and just ask them what do they see from their perspective where they sit within the building life cycle. Maybe Brittany, if you could start us off.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a really great question. I really do think that there is just like you said, a major overall adoption of utilizing BIM, but there is, I would say, quite a broad definition of what BIM actually is. And I think there's a distinction between process and software, and that's something that I often talk with my owner clients, my owner operator clients about. What is it even going to be used for? That sort of level of thinking, is it strictly for design? Is it so that there's clash detection in order to reduce the amount of change orders, or is it really taking it through the entire life cycle? So I think that that's a larger discussion, but I think absolutely, yeah, the state of the industry is we know it's important and there are efficiencies to be gained.
Yeah. Well, thanks for that, Brittany. Chris, any perspective? You know, you deal a lot on the FM side. You also deal with in the AEC space. So any comments that you'd like to share with the group?
Yeah, I think Brittany, you know, has a good point, as in, you know, when we talk to owners, it's about really figuring out, you know, the why for the data. I mean, I think the issue in the past is people, you know, go through the whole project and then try to decide how maybe they're going to use that model at the end of the game. Many owners we deal with, it's like what people don't understand is that you have to understand the client, and the client has to understand what they're going to get out of that data at the end. If you don't do that, you know, it's kind of lost from the beginning. So it takes investment of time, but we are seeing more and more clients go that route. And I think the industry will only improve as people answer that why ahead of time and make sure that they're modeling and going through the life cycle with, you know, the data that they need.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that, Chris. And actually, it's kind of the beginning with the end in mind. You know, the planning process that's got to happen up front is different in a BIM paradigm of delivery than it is with the legacy methodologies we used to use. Ken, did you have, from a building product manufacturer's perspective, what are, you've kind of gone through the gamut with getting your content built, and, you know, you've been at this for quite a few years, so it'd be interesting to get your perspective from a manufacturer's side.
Sure. You know, we've been at it, as you said, for quite some time. We've built over 550 product models covering thousands of SKUs. We've got, I think at this point, almost $1 million invested in models. You know, it's very important for us to understand, you know, where this is headed. We know it's the future, but I think we learned early on, obviously, a lot of manufacturers in the industry had some false starts. You know, they wanted to jump in and create models. They created models that were, you know, far too robust and large file sizes that were crushing systems. I think that held some people back on the manufacturing side from getting our models adopted. We also still see a misalignment between the design, in a design build project, the misalignment from, you know, the AE firm to the contractor. You know, in a project I've seen, you know, both of them using Revit, but not connecting the models. I think we see going forward, you know, more projects with the design build implementation method, adopting Revit as a holistic tool, you know, with all of the subs and the GC. That seems to work well for us, and that's where we're focusing a lot of our efforts right now, is getting out in front of those customers. Hello?
I'll jump in here just to keep things moving. And I know, Jim, are you online now? Let's see if your audio has come back in just so we can get your perspective from the manufacturer side as well.
I don't think Jim's with us, Virginia. I'm sorry I was on mute. But I think what you've heard from all the stakeholders is that the you know, the migration's in process. You know, you're seeing it on the owner side, you're seeing it within the AEC. The building product manufacturers, I can remember when we were working, you know, 10 years ago with them, you had to spend half your time explaining what building information modeling was, and it's definitely it's a different conversation now, which is good. So that migration is happening. The challenges, and really for the state of the industry, and this kind of will segue into the next slide, is if you look at the legacy challenges, you know, business challenges just in terms of cost and investment, and then the technology challenges, meaning the state of the actual technology that allows us to execute in a BIM environment, you know, those are all pretty significant challenges. So next slide, Virginia. And again, from the Dodge Smart Market Report, you can see the challenges that we've just shared with you anecdotally, the information you heard from the stakeholders, it's pretty consistent with what the data is that's being gathered is telling us. So, the cost of the solution is a big challenge. There's concerns about data security, and there's also concerns about data ownership. We all know that from personal experience. And then I think this next slide, the next stat is pretty interesting: the resistance to change. There's a lot, and it's funny that the engineering space is the most resistant, which the space that I'm in, and that's probably consistent with what you've experienced as well, Chris. But the engineers are probably the toughest ones to really get them over the line.
Yeah, most definitely.
Oops, go ahead, Chris.
No, I think obviously they have the challenge of not having a huge return on investment in the life cycle. So dealing with less time, less money, and more deliverables is usually not a good equation.
Yeah, no, it definitely is challenging. So when we look at the key hurdles to realizing return on investment, when we're looking at BIM paradigm versus our legacy process and deliverables, we see a big challenge is getting people to reset their processes or their workflows and understanding that the deliverable now is a different animal. One of the things that we saw early on, even within our own firm, is that the AEs in the AE space, our teams wanted to treat BIM like, okay, it's a new version of CAD. And now the challenge with that is it's a different skill set because the design's integrated with the tool. It's not simply giving somebody a markup and getting them to execute on that markup to create a deliverable. So you have to have new and different skill sets, and new jobs are being created. Like 10 years ago, to have a design technologist as part of an AE firm was really unheard of. Chris, any color you want to provide on that?
Yeah, I agree. I think that the issue is in treating it like CAD or the model, trying to do is the bare minimum, and then having I think most of the time what's being asked of the AE space is not very exacting. So you get into trying to deliver all of that and not a lot of content and not understanding data. So for them, I see the same thing. It's a difficult process. If things were a little bit more clear on the delivery, I think things would move along a little bit quicker.
Very good. Thanks for that, Chris. So, Ken, I'm going to direct this one at you, really. But, on the other side of the market, the building product manufacturers, I'm sure that you're seeing a change and hurdles to actually realizing ROI from, all the investment you've made into BIM technologies in the form of content and other things, and having to provide the customer their data in a form that they can readily consume it. Anything you'd like to share on that, Ken?
Yeah, absolutely. When you start talking about spending millions of dollars on things in today's climate, it's always what's the ROI, especially at the leadership level for myself. And it has been a challenge for us because in the past you give somebody a memory stick with models on it, or they download the models from the website, or get them from somewhere. And we wouldn't have any clear understanding of, did they get used or not on a project. And so, I think that's where working with the contractors more directly, we're able to see it from cradle to grave. We're able to see, working with them to develop the model content. And in some cases with some of the contractors, like a Rosendon Electric, we've worked with them to marry our models and content with their models and content for like products. That seems to be a good model for the large contractors, and we've already started to see success from that. They've been very open in working with us as a partner and showing us the value on the other end when they put our put our product out onto the project. So it's ever evolving, but we're hoping through partnerships with companies like UNIFI that can help manage that data and give us a better understanding of where that data is going, that we'll be able to see that ROI prove itself out in spades over the next couple of years.
So, Ken, a quick follow-on to that, just out of curiosity and for the audience, how do you see the engagement with the contractor versus the engagement with the AEs? And I guess what I'm driving at, do you see that the contractors are much more kind of open to bringing you in and partnering with you than the AEs are, or is it consistent on both sides?
Dwayne, that's a very good question. The AEs are our friends, and we've worked with the AE firms for many years. That's one of the places I got my start in the industry. They'll take our models, and I have no doubt that some of them are using them to some extent, but they're not working with us or bringing us in to, work collaboratively to adjust the models or what have you. Whereas, as I mentioned on the contractor side, it's very interesting, especially the larger contractors. Nowadays, my teams, we're talking each of the major firms, whether it's a Berg or a Helix or a Rosendin, some of the large contractors or a Turner, they've all got, people in senior level leadership positions in charge of BIM and technology. And they're very open to working with the right manufacturers that understand what BIM is and the promise of it, and can talk technically toe-to-toe with their people. I think that's a big deal. You have to have your teams. You got sales teams out on the front line that certainly can hand out models and talk, to get people engaged. But, one of the things that we found out, we have to have people on the back end that can have a more robust conversation with the client to, either go and have a direct meeting face-to-face with the client or have a couple of webinars or something to get them going. We found that to be very, very beneficial to us because they see that it's not just a manufacturer hucking a model at them. It's a true partner that understands their challenges and, can help them even in some regards in ways that maybe they haven't thought about.
Oh, very good. I appreciate that insight. That's really good. Chris, with EngineWorks, you guys are content experts, and you've been at this game a long time. We've known each other for quite some time, and the content space has been such a challenge and such a wild, wild west for so long. So what we've really found is that, the content's got to be fit for purpose. It's got to, and kind of back to what Ken was saying between the AEs and the contractors, it's got to have context for workflow. And as it, really, if it's going to migrate across the building lifecycle, it's got to have, context for each of the stakeholders are basically going to handle it. Anything you'd like to share around, the content side in terms of the migration of the content through the building lifecycle?
Yeah, I think that obviously, just like Ken said, manufacturers, it's a much more difficult game than just building a piece of content. It's a huge data game. It's serving many types of users, whether it's AE, contractor, owner, on that side. So they definitely have a tall order to deliver that stuff and get the ROI. Obviously now with the combination of Revit and fabrication kind of coming together, or people attempting to bring those two together, I think the market then gets a little bit more confusing on that side, because you're going to have the transitional time frame of those who have spent a lot of money on fabrication. And, you have to pick and choose your spots, because there's still large contractors that are going to use that content. And then those who are trying to use Revit or, trying to meld the two together. So, I think that the promising thing is that many manufacturers know they have to deliver this content, that, they understand that it's more than the content on that side. And then hopefully as time goes on here, the melding of Revit and fabrication becomes, easier and easier, which will help the market, and obviously is going to help the life cycle by passing that data and transitioning it through the AEC phases.
Yeah, and I think that's a good segue too, Chris, because, you know, the AECs and BPMs, you know, we're starting to realize, hey, geometry, that's just the beginning. And yeah, I was on in a conversation with Jim yesterday, and we're talking about it. And, you know, years past, it was really BM. There was no I. It was all about visualization and maybe a little bit of clash. But what's really happening is we're finding out more and more, particularly you get to the FM side of it, you get to the owner side of it, the data and how it migrates from stakeholder to stakeholder is really what's going to drive the industry. And with the model needing to survive, you know, we have to get rid of the recreation of AE work by the contractor and then again by the owner, and that's our conventional, you know, AEs deliver a drawing, contractor develops a separate set of plans that are shop drawings and a separate set of as-builds. Then if the owner is wanting to leverage the information that they have for FM, they've got to recreate the same data again. A huge waste, and it kind of helps explain the disparity between the lack of the efficiency losses that we've actually had versus everybody else gaining with technology. And it really is, you know, the legacy process that's driving us. And so, Brittany, on the owner side, you know, in terms of the model survival and really trying to leverage the asset afterwards, you know, once they're owning and operating, any perspective or comments you might have on that?
Well, actually, I'd like to start from the beginning, before the project starts, because I think that's when the strategic planning needs to take place then. And I know that we at MACE, we really try to start really developing a strategic plan, really discussing with the owner how BIM can be utilized. We actually walk them through all the scenarios, whether it's 3D, 4D, what level of design is needed in which area, whether it's heavy mechanical or if it's not even needed, you know, at a higher level, it could be a low level in another area. Asking those questions and then identifying, you know, at that high level what's needed, then really mapping out a BIM execution plan, because that's the thing that's going to model the true migration of data throughout the entirety of the project. And that's going to ensure that when the handoff takes place, you're getting exactly what you need, but in addition to that, you're getting what you need throughout the entirety of the project as well, from design to manufacturing, making sure that the lead times of the actual materials are coming in on time and can be constructed. So it's really, to me, an overall project focus, not just the technology and the design itself.
No, I think that's a great point, because, I mean, it really does take the holistic view, and it goes back to kind of what Chris was saying about, you know, you really have to, you know, begin with the beginning. You know, you have to start there, and that's really good perspective. So from an AEC and you know, the owner and BPMs, investment has been a consistent challenge. You know, Ken alluded to it, where, you know, you're trying to get dollars approved to build this new format of data that you want to get out to your customers, and the levers that he would have to pull within his industry. And I know as an AE, you know, we're probably the most cash crunched of the stakeholders, and we'll probably all argue about that. But you know, to get people to invest in retooling and invest in a technology platform, I mean, it really comes directly out of profits. You know, the training time, the retooling, and buying the various software packages. And I think you see the same thing on the contractor side. You know, everybody's got to make this investment, and they're all asking the questions about ROI, and that really kind of segues us into the next slide. And the way you're going to realize ROI is through collaborative BIM best practices. And I think it starts, as Brittany alluded to, at the very beginning of the job. If you don't begin with the end in mind, and you start to try to pick this up halfway through the project, which is what happens quite a bit from my personal experience with BIM in the AE space. It's just, you know, get the model done. It's that drawing mindset that we've got to issue a deliverable. So with all the challenges that we just discussed in mind, I want to transition the discussion a little bit and really go to best practices. You know, what are some of the things that our panelists have leveraged to successfully overcome some of the hurdles that we discussed in the previous slide? So I'd like to start out with, if we hand the mic over maybe to Ken, and Jim, if you're on, you can maybe follow on to Ken for the education and training piece of it. So, Ken, what have you had to do to educate your sales staff?
Well, that's certainly an ongoing challenge. As I mentioned before, we've been at this a while, so we're consistently working to keep our folks updated. I mean, everyone has on my team, out calling on AE firms and large contractors and global accounts like Microsoft and Apple and Google. They're trained fairly proficiently, in talking about 3D modeling and the benefits of our models, maybe versus others. Talking about some of the challenges because they're talking to a variety of different clients, so that they've been doing this for a while and they've been in the trenches. So we've given them a certain level of expertise. As I mentioned before, what we found though is that we got to quickly, once we identify the right stakeholders within an organization, whether it be a contractor or a large AE firm or an owner that are interested in doing more development or co-development with our models, we're quick to bring in other resources that we have to bear that have the technical chops to get in the trenches with the leaders of these organizations, and as I said before as well, not just talk about what we can do, but what we found is actually helping them educate, just helping them educate them on what's going on really raises our credibility as a manufacturer. So once again, we're not just saying, hey, here's our model, use it. We're saying, hey, here's the models we've developed. Here's, the reason we developed them in this fashion. Let's take a look at what you're doing. In the case of Rosendin, they wanted to take some of their models and blend them together, like let's say for a floor box model, they already had some models developed. They really, wanted to standardize, on ours, but they had some attributes to theirs they really liked. So we blended those together, and then we put them on a platform like UNIFI so that all of their offices can have a consistent access to the model. So we're finding that to be a very attractive approach. Once again, it raises our credibility with the contractors. We're not just a manufacturer of really, really good products, obviously, but we understand their challenges, and we're there as a partner to help them evolve in the modeling space.
No, very good. That's great insight. And then, so the education that you're really talking about, it goes beyond just, your team internally. It's also working with the contractor, educating yourself and probably educating them on the product, the product content that you've been able to develop. So that's a big effort. Brittany, if you could discuss a little bit maybe about better collaboration workflows. There's been some successes you've had around or developing the better collaboration workflows.
Yeah, and I don't know, I guess as a project manager, I'm always thinking of how best to set up the project. I think that's sort of been the common theme that I've been discussing throughout this webinar, but I think it really starts when you're procuring for the architect and engineer and the contractor, and really setting the tone for the culture of the project so that it can be more collaborative. Set up the consistent meetings, let people know what type of information is required from anyone, and especially the owner, if it's asset information, details on what their, what heating system they'd like to have, things of that nature, and really setting it up so that those touches can take place in a more formal sense. And then also on the back end, I mean, there's an opportunity to do a BIM cave, however you want to look at it, but there's always a need to look at how you're going to procure. So design build, there's certainly an opportunity to look at that as a delivery model that promotes more collaboration. It really happens a lot between the designer and the contractor, which is super helpful, but I think the IPD, or integrated form of agreement, that really kind of gets everyone committed and on the same page, where you could have your HVAC contractor doing a design build approach, and part of the contract directly with the architect, engineer, and the primary general contractor, which in itself promotes more collaboration. And I think the models of integrated deliveries promotes more of a collaborative workflow. And I think educating about those delivery styles can also elevate the desire to utilize BIM, because you can maximize that time better. You're not thinking about, oh, how many hours are we spending on XYZ project anymore. It's, let's think about some of the incentives that we're going to get from the IFOA agreement. Or from a design build perspective, we don't have to run 10 million things in front of the owner anymore. We can just collaborate and make sure it works. So I think there's some advantages to thinking about how to procure in order to promote collaboration.
Oh, that's great. No, thanks, Brittany. And that's, you see that really, it kind of changes the conventional, the legacy, or the historical relationship between the AEC, or AEs and the Cs in particular, particularly on the engineers. You know, the engineers working closely in collaboration with the, you know, your mechanical, your electrical, and your technology subcontractors. And then, Chris, from your perspective, you know, the increased upfront project planning, and then also, you know, and how that relates to technology, and anything you want to share on that in terms of how collaboration around those can help?
Well, I think that obviously the biggest issue is, you know, how we're bringing this data together, whether it's, you know, sharing a model on C4R, or, you know, there's so many different type of products out there, and, you know, people trying to get, you know, Revit, but then they have Fab, which a lot of you know, viewers can't see. But again, as long as, you know, the plan up front is set, you know, closely, I see more and more teams having more success. And obviously there's the whole, you know, we talk about design assist and design build, which are coming on strong. So, you know, I see one of the questions here on the Q&A, you know, about A&Es sharing their model. But as time goes on, those are, the line is blurred, where, you know, a lot of contractors are, you know, from design development, taking over or working closely with the engineer. And I think as more, you know, more of that goes on, it seems to really help the process, because, again, more people are upfront tied together, and there's a better workflow.
It's a good segue to our next slide, because now we can talk a little bit about ROI. And thanks for that insight, Chris, because you're right, there's a myriad of technologies out there, and it's such a challenge to really, you know, figure out which tool set, or what's the toolbox you're going to build for the project that you're going to execute on. So as far as ROI goes, you know, one of the things that we've seen, and it's funny because you've heard it probably over and over again so far in the webinar from the panelists, but from an AE perspective of NV5, you know, we found a number of projects where we'd get started with an architect, we'd start running down the road and, you know, developing, you know, a LOD 400 or an LOD that just was totally misaligned with what the expectations were for the project. And what we started to do to mitigate that, because it was a huge cost impact to us because of the time that was required to go to that level of development that really didn't make sense for the project. And what we found is the pre-project planning, really sitting down with the architect and the contractor, if you can get them, and talking to the owner, just as Brittany was saying, look, what is the expectation? Are we just going to use this for visualization? If it's just visualization, let's make sure that, you know, we do our work so it's fit for purpose and doesn't, you know, go overboard on what we're going to provide. So really understanding that, and Brittany was so spot on with her comment about you've got to start at the very outset setting the tone, and I like that, setting the culture of the project with respect to how we're going to leverage BIM. Ken, can you discuss how Legrand has created your content in collaboration with your customers in order to deliver the kind of Revit content that they actually need? Is that getting you specified more frequently? I mean, is there any, just whatever you want to share on that?
Yeah, sure. You know, but as I said, we started on the journey, you know, many years ago, and I'll readily admit that we, like many manufacturers, just jumped in and said, okay, you know, let's start creating models. And we went out there and we, you know, dropped off a bunch of jump drives to AE firms. That was our initial focus. And we wondered, sort of why it wasn't working. We found out through, going back and listening to the customer that said, our models were too big, too bulky, not really practical. So we readjusted our thinking a bit. We found a different partner to help develop our content. We started to have collaborative conversations with the consultants, and then, as I said, just more recently, the contractors, to instead of just building models and shoving them out there and hoping that someone will use them, to have much more strategic conversations with key customers and to co-develop models in many cases, or just readjustment of our existing models to fit the need of that particular customer seems to work better. Now, we're in early days, so as I mentioned, Rosendin Electric and a couple of others like MC Dean have started to adopt our models as standards. That's certainly good for us. Those are strategic customers for us as a company. On the AE side, we've actually had a few AE firms start to adopt, and we've gotten a couple of emails congratulating us on how well we've done with our model development. So I think I wish I could just say we could identify hundreds of projects and here's the exact ROI. We don't have that today, but I can tell you that the level of engagement is so strong with our customers, and it's become part of our value proposition. It's ingrained in us, and we're not letting up, because I see article after article. I read one this morning on prefab and where that's headed, globally. We are woefully behind here in the U.S., and as prefab becomes much more prevalent in the U.S., I think that's also going to drive the need to have, robust 3D modeling capabilities, and people are going to have to get all the oars in the water.
Yeah, no, I think it's a great point, and I guess what you have found is you've gotten better at being able to look at cause and effect. Now you're putting these models out here, you're engaging with the customers directly, and it's so the specification more frequently. You don't have the absolute data on it, but it's better than where you were probably 2 or 3 years ago for sure.
Yeah, I think just the guidance to anybody that, especially manufacturers, is don't just go out and hand out models on jump drives. Have conversations with your customers on where they are in the development of models. Just holistically as an organization. If it's project specific, ask them what LOD it is. If they're just at LOD 100 or 200. Probably not worth our while, but if it's 400, we probably should be very highly engaged in that.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. So, Brittany, from the owner side, any ROI example you can give us? Maybe a reduction in change orders on a project that you saw, or what are you seeing in terms of a way that demonstrates the ROI from BIM?
Yeah, absolutely, a reduction in change orders. And to be honest, I've been in a couple of scenarios where the LOD has not been defined extremely clearly. And so I guess it's kind of talking to some of those key hurdles again. I've had challenges where there are more change orders if that's not defined early on. But if it's done properly with the type of collaboration that we're talking about, yeah, there's definitely benefits on that end. There's always a question of, are you going to pay the architect an additional cost to provide, like take the as-built drawings from the contractor at the end of the project, all of the trades themselves, and have them incorporated into the final design with all of the change orders, any other bulletins or addendums that were included. So you have a handoff. So there's a question as to whether you sort of invest in BIM up front to the level of design that's going to give the detail of information that's going to be needed. There's a question as to whether that investment is necessary at that time, or do you want to invest it on the back end and have everyone sort of pull it together and make it work as an as-built, which is essentially what they'll need in the end. I think there's always sort of this dance that you do when you're talking with the owner operator about what they're needing and the qualifications of the people that you are bringing on board for the project. But when the collaboration happens properly, yes, there is a major benefit, especially when there's heavy mechanical MEP coordination that needs to take place, certainly.
Yeah, no, I'd agree with that, especially with structure and the conflicts that go there. That's really good, and you bring up a good point, because it doesn't do the owner any good if you give them this incredible coordinated model with all of the data mapped appropriately, and they don't really have the people who even know what to do with it. Now it sits on a server somewhere rather than as a rolled up drawing somewhere in a closet. Chris, last one on this. I'd like to see what your perspective might be, either contractor, subcontractor, owner perspective, or on the FM side, an ROI on a use case that maybe you'd like to share.
Yeah, I mean, we have one hospital client that we've probably worked with for about 4 years, and I think again, they were like most clients that, they had BIM models, they required BIM, but they really didn't do much with it. And it was design, bid, build, everything they did. And we were brought on to try to use that data. Again, it took a long time because if you think about the owner seeing what they need, a lot of them don't know. And you also have to talk to all the groups internally because, with big data, I mean, really it's going to be the integration of that data with a lot of groups and what does each group want from it. And when you get to that, what products are going to be used to filter that data or integrate it once the model is done. So, the good thing is we had I think like Brittany was talking about the execution plans. I think one of the issues in the business is that, to me, a lot of people use, execution plans that, in my opinion, are either design implementation plans or contractor implementation plans, but very few owner or life cycle. And so that's what we try to create is the life cycle for defining each of the groups so that the owner then can get the data they're looking for. And I think in the industry, the only way that we improve that curve that you had on the second slide is that if we don't integrate what we do, then that curve's never going to improve. But the good part is we know there's a lot of products, and I think as everything keeps on evolving, once you know what data you need and what you're trying to do with it, I think once you can get to trying to pick what tools you need in the toolbox, that's where the big changes will take place. But for this client, obviously now they can tie data from the model and start getting it to the end. It's not going to happen overnight because of the amount of groups and people, but at least they're looking at it, and I think that's the point. Nothing's easy in technology. There's no ROI that is so convincing to everyone that someone goes, oh, let me get on that right away. So I think it's education, and I think obviously like anything else in technology, people have to make the commitment. But I think today, if you make the commitment, there's a light at the end of the tunnel.
No, I appreciate that. That's really good insight from your perspective, Chris. Next slide. So it's been a great discussion, and and now just kind of to summarize for the remainder of the webinar, what I'd like to do is we're just going to talk a little bit about the future, and we want to make sure we get to your questions. So if you look at the industry, especially the organizations that have been early adopters of BIM and are further along in their maturity spectrum, it's realizing now that ultimately it's all going to be about the data. those people, the parties who can really enable seamless migration of data between stakeholders in the tranche of the life cycle or across the building life cycle changes in phase, all the way from the architects, engineers, contractor, owner, operator, and the BPM integrated in that process. That's going to really be the catalyst for the model survival through all phases of the building life cycle. And the collaboration and stakeholder engagement is really the key to success. You heard a lot about the upfront planning. I mean, you really have to begin with the end in mind, and if you don't and you try to change course midstream, it's really a challenge. We can't work in vacuums anymore, and I think particularly in the AE community, it was, you get your drawings done and you would throw them over the wall, and hopefully the client gets what they're looking for. And on the BPM side, those BIM advanced BPMs, some of the things that, Ken's group is doing in terms of customer engagement, I think there's some real lessons learned in that, in how you really have to deploy on your BIM content, and ultimately it's going to drive more revenue for their business. And the AEC firms and owners who are adopting the technology and really moving, really looking for that collaborative process, being the ones that are putting their hand up and saying, you know what, we really need to spend more time up front to plan this out and to map it and to have a strategy for how we're going to, what our BIM strategy is going to be for the project, and then get all the stakeholders engaged in it. So, if you think about the winners and the losers in all of this, those who cling to the past and insist on doing it the old way, you're going to lose market share, because we're seeing an acceleration in the rate of BIM adoption. Now we've got really good economic tailwinds. You're going to see even the tight-fisted A&Es are going to be more and more inclined to adopt more technologies to help improve their workflows, because they're getting busier and they've got to realize efficiencies. So in summary, we'll go to the next slide. So in summary, we are in a process of moving past the conversation about what started out as building modeling, is moving, and 3D is now moving into a discussion really about big data and data-driven design. How's the data going to get structured as it migrates through the building life cycle, and how are we going to wrangle it so that it's useful for all the stakeholders who want to leverage it? Next slide. So I think we have some questions that have come in. And let me get to the Q&A tab, and we'll try to address those. Let's see. So, Virginia, can you help move the questions along? I'm having a hard time with my computer.
Yeah, for sure. I think one good one that came in to kind of open up to the panel is, how do AEC firm billings reflect the enhanced value proposition for owners? So if owners are seeing increased ROI for facility management and throughout the building life cycle, is there also room for increased upfront margins for the AE or C?
That is an awesome question.
I knew Chris and I would jump on it.
Well, I don't, Dwayne, you can jump in, but no, I think
you go.
All right. I mean, I think that is the biggest problem. I think as owners get more ROI, they in turn think that design and contracting should decrease in cost. But the reality, and for contractors, because they get ROI out of prefabrication, collision detection, that type of stuff, that definitely helps them on the labor side. They get a good ROI where their costs can be the same and they can be more efficient. I think the unfortunate part in the A&E side is that it would be fair, because it does take more work. It's not less work. And I don't think that owners see it that way. But I think if as we go further in the life cycle and things are more defined and more realistic, then what you would hope is on the A&E side that it would be more efficient, because the fee would match the deliverable. I think that now, I don't think those two match in reality. So I think that has to be adjusted. I don't know. Call me crazy. I do not see owners pushing fees up a lot based on delivering a technology that they think is just already adopted.
Yeah, and I would add on to that, Chris, because if you look at the expense and reward ratio, so the AEs for us, it's a pure expense because we have to, we have to retool, we have to the workflow. It's a more upfront investment on our end, but the savings aren't realized until you get into the construction phase and reduce change orders, and those savings are going to the owner. So, from a contractor's perspective, hey, if I invest in this technology, I'm going to drive, less change orders, more efficient job. I'm going to make more money. On the AE side, we're not really in that. So pushing the fees, and Chris is spot on. The owners think, oh, it's just a new form of delivery, and I expect you to do it for, actually you should do it for less than what the CAD took, and that just doesn't really align with reality.
Well, and if I can add to the discussion from the owner's perspective, I think this is where the education comes in, right? So you're asking about the ROI for the facilities management piece, right, for that life cycle. It all depends on how you plan on using the BIM data. If you're looking at it from an asset perspective and you're tying this into their IWMS system, right, so they have all their lease assets listed out, they have all their equipment, they can better incorporate that into their maintenance review and make sure that that cycle takes place and it's much better. I think there is a consideration about that investment on the front end that sometimes needs to be articulated early on. And I think we as an industry, we need to do better about describing some of those benefits. And again, it really matters how the owner-operators are taking the information and utilizing it on throughout the life cycle of the buildings or whatever the particular entity is. So that's my perspective.
That's a really good point. Virginia, you want to tee us up with the next question?
Yeah, I think we probably have time for just one more question here. So, and Dwayne, this might be a good one for you. This came in near the beginning of the webinar, especially in relation to UNIFI. But we have a question around how quickly do you see that the industry is transitioning to cloud-based content management for BIM versus more traditional server-based workflows?
Well, I think the challenge with the server-based workflows, if you're a single office practice, that might work perfectly well for you. But as soon as you get to a point where you're in multiple offices, you really need to, for a consistent library and consistent to be able to administer it, across multiple offices, it really drives you to cloud. And with what's happening with cloud, across our businesses, between what Microsoft is doing in the cloud and a lot of the different cloud applications, I mean, it's a lot of what was on premise. If you look in server rooms now, particularly for, NV5 is about, 2,500 people. We've got 115 offices or whatever. So, if you're not cloud-based and you're trying to do it via enterprise on premise, what ends up happening is it becomes a real choke point because you're trying to grab somebody's server, may say it's in Boston, where I am today, and maybe it's our Vegas office that is trying to grab the content. You look at just the time that takes and the on-site maintenance you've got associated with the equipment. You migrate it to the cloud, you can have access from anywhere. So a lot of the conveniences that we see on our mobile apps and our phones, via, whether it's OneNote or it's Dropbox, UNIFI is really kind of built on that model where it's access from anywhere and controlled access from anywhere, and plus your versioning and your ability to administer is really an important part of what you're doing with your libraries. You've got to be able to control the information and be able to push out updates. So I see that more and more you move more and more server equipment and technology is moving off premise into the cloud. And I think it's going to be the same thing. A single office group, if they want to keep it local and all their work is local, there's some logic to that. But as soon as you get into multiple offices, it becomes a very complex equation. And one of the things we wanted to make sure of is that you could have the ability to control content across a global organization. So hopefully that answers the question.
Hey, Dwayne, can you hear me?
Yeah. Yes.
Okay, Jim. Hey, finally I was able to dial in. Hey, you know, we actually, part of one of our Smart Market reports actually specifically brought this up and dealt with this. And what we found is we did a survey of over 200 stakeholders, AEC stakeholders, and almost 98% are using some sort of cloud-based collaboration solution. So cloud, we are moving to the cloud rapidly, and about 2/3, 63%, are using it on over half of their projects. So we are moving to the cloud rapidly, but you know, cloud is a very generic term. I mean, there's FTP sites, there's drop boxes, which are not industry specific, and then there are industry specific ones. Of those, FTP sites are the least satisfying of the cloud methods. So I think what we're seeing is really a push towards the industry specific cloud solutions and the drop boxes of the world.
Yeah, well, appreciate that, Jim. And Jim, you're just in time. We're about to close out because we're out of time. So
sorry about that.
No worries. I'd like to thank everybody for your attendance today. If your question didn't get answered, as I said at the beginning, we will be sending an email out. And you know, just to wrap up, I want to thank our panelists. It's been a great conversation, and we look forward to continuing it offline with all of you soon. So thanks so much, and Virginia, you can close us out.
All right, thanks everyone for a great webinar. I'll mention that a recording of the event will be sent out to all registrants later today, so look out for that via email. Thanks again for everyone's time. We really appreciate it.